Okay. Let me go here. Come back here. Let's send that out. Okay. Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this presentation. This presentation is in two parts. Each part is roughly right around 25 minutes, and then there will be about a 5 to 10 minute break between. I do hope that everyone will be able to stay to tune in to both parts, but if not, each of them will be recorded, and you can always view it later. The situation the USA finds itself in today, with all the division and even political violence, is reminiscent of another time in the nation's history, about 160 years ago. Back then, all the toxic rhetoric and factional politics ended in a bloody civil war. This presentation is about what fostered that political climate. The hope is that understanding that might help us avoid a repeat of what is still the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. Almost before the Revolutionary War cannons had cooled, the new nation faced its first major test of survival, a challenge that led to the adoption of the Constitution, and giving birth to the federal government. But I propose that while the Constitution fixed some issues, it broke some others and caused open sores that oozed and festered until they erupted into full scale outbreak. Contrary to what mainstream history would lead one to believe, the primary issues that fuel the flames of revolution and forged an alliance of the patriots across the socioeconomic divide, no less, that they were actually at odds. And those differences became more and more apparent in the decades leading up to the Civil War and looms over politics even in the USA today. So, what drove the Patriot Alliance? What were their issues? What inspired the revolution? How did the founding of the USA lead to civil war? And what legacy does history impose on today's society? These are the questions this presentation will explore. So let's begin at the beginning with the title, Civil War Politics in the 21st Century, Legacy of the Revolution. Okay, that's a mouthful. Let's break it down. Politics. So politics are predicated on organized alliances. They usually form around one or several issues, or sometimes a successive issues, sometimes with the same alliance, or sometimes with new alliances. New issues will cause shifting alliances, and sometimes cause even new political organizations. Civil war. Okay, war is contentious by nature, so that's conflict. And civil would indicate internal. So these are internal conflicts. What are these conflicts? They're hot button issues that get voters excited or passionate. And then politicians turn around and push these buttons in order to draw voters to their cause. These are always relatable, kitchen table kind of issues. Sometimes they have a direct impact, like inflation is a good example of that. You go to the grocery store, you see the prices there. You go to the gas pump, you see the prices. You feel the effects of inflation directly. But sometimes the impact is indirect, but the issue raises very strong emotions. Gay marriage is a good example of that one. People have very strong feelings one way or another, but let's face it, Who lies awake at night worried about two men or two women they may not even know, married to each other somewhere out there? Okay, no direct impact in the 21st century. So these some of these issues from the Civil War era actually still have an impact on today's politics, and they remain every bit as contentious today. And we'll look at some of those later. But the discord of the Civil War era was itself a result of issues that had been festering since the Revolution, such as states' rights, for example, that being the authority of federal governments versus state governments. Another good example is compensation for labor, which, of course, before the Civil War was defined by the unpaid labor of slavery. Then, legacy of the revolution. So, legacy is something current that is the result of something from the past, in this case, the revolution. And for our purposes, we're going to extend the revolution past the official end of which was the Treaty of Paris in 1783. That officially ended the war, but we're going to go a little past that into the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So then, this presentation is about organized alliances that form around internal conflicts that have persisted since the Civil War into the present day, that have their roots in the revolution. But before we discuss these conflicts, we need to understand political alliances and why people form them. So, political alliances generally fall into one of three categories. First, and this is in no particular order, liberal alliances. So, liberal alliances form around liberal causes, and liberal causes tend to be very personal in nature: personal freedom, private property, political equity, meaning no respecter of persons, no double standards, equal protection, equal accountability. Well, these are things that everybody wants, at least for themselves, right? So we can include liberal causes in the other two types of political alliances: radical and conservative. And the difference between radical and conservative has to do with how they view change. So radicals like change. They find it highly desirable. As a matter of fact, radicals work for change. And the kind of change they like is immediate and drastic. Now, what would make somebody want that kind of change? Well, they're probably uncomfortable. They may be feeling some pain, maybe a sense of danger, perhaps for themselves personally, or maybe their property. They may be experiencing frustration or feeling exploited or abused, and they are looking for relief. Uncomfortable people tend to form radical alliances. On the other hand, conservatives dislike change. They find it highly undesirable. They would prefer no change at all. But if it has to happen, the kind of change they like is slow and methodical. So they must be having a very different experience from the radicals, right? They must be feeling pretty comfortable, probably feeling a sense of ease for themselves, safety for their person, security for their property, feeling a sense of empowerment, a sense of control for their life, for their destiny. Why should anything change? Comfortable people tend to form conservative alliances. Now, there are a couple of points about these alliances. Nature favors the radicals. You've probably heard that expression, nothing is sure but change. Change is going to happen. So conservatives are always anxious, and they tend to have this obsessive need for control. I mean, they can't stop change, right? So they have to settle for trying to control it. Secondly, politics is always about survival, real or perceived. Always. If it's not about survival, it's not really politics. So basically, people organized into political alliances for survival. That being said, what were the survival issues that drove the patriots who rebelled against Britain into alliance? To answer that question, we need to understand a little bit about colonial society. So, in the colonial era, before the states were united, they were 13 separate English colonies and had been for many years. I mean, Georgia was the youngest colony, but it was already almost 45 years old. Virginia, the oldest colony, was more than 160 years old. So these were well established societies. But colonial societies were just byproducts of the main reason for establishing the colonies, which was to make money. The colonies were primarily commercial entities, that is, businesses. And just like there are different types of businesses, there were different types of colonies depending on who held the charter, which is the equivalent of a business license. So a charter colony was established by a bunch of businessmen or some investors in Britain who had organized a charter company, which was basically a corporation. They made the laws and rules for their colony, which is roughly the equivalent of articles of incorporation. And as long as those laws, they just needed to stay within British law. And then the money that was generated within the colony or from the colony was the return on their investment. Then there were proprietary colonies. These were basically rewards from the king to privileged elites or the British aristocracy. A proprietor could be one person, like Elon Musk, or a small group, like the Walton family that owns Walmart. Proprietary charters were granted for various reasons. For example, the charter for New York was a gift from the king to his brother, the Duke of York. The king granted the charter for Pennsylvania to pay off one of his debts. And like the charter company, a proprietor had the authority to establish the laws and rules for the colony, again, as long as they stayed within British law. And the thing to remember about a proprietary colony is that it was private property. The whole colony was the personal private property of the proprietor. And all of the money that was generated went to the person or group that held the charter, the proprietor, to enrich that person or group. Then there were crown colonies or royal colonies. So sometimes they're called provincial colonies because essentially they were British provinces. Georgia is a good example of that. The British Parliament put up the money. The king granted the charter to a group of trustees. And they established some unique rules, like a ban on slavery, interestingly enough, even though it was still legal in Britain. But for the most part, the inhabitants in a royal colony were subject only to British law. The royal colony's government was established, excuse me, by the British government. Sometimes, and it might have included a local representation or a legislature that represented people locally, but not always. And then, of course, the money that was generated in a royal colony went directly to the British government to enrich the British government. Most charter holders were absentee owners. The Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony is one exception, but typically charter holders didn't actually live in the colonies. What they did was recruited people to live and, most importantly, to work there, because it was, of course, the work of the people who lived in the colonies that was going to generate any money to be made. So, who were these people living in the colonies and doing this work that was generating this money? Well, let's break it down demographically, starting with the white men and their families, predominantly British, of course, but also they were French, Irish, Dutch, Germans, even a few Finns and Swedes. They were Protestants, Jews, Catholics, but this colonial demographic was divided not so much by nationality as by class, the haves versus the have-nots, with all the haves being superior to the have-nots. But over time, between religious tolerance and the dominance of the British culture, these white colonists went from being culturally diverse to being socially and culturally homogenous, which is where we get the idea of the USA as a melting pot. Then, let's see, then the Africans. So the Africans were culturally and socially diverse. First, they came from different backgrounds. Some had been kidnapped and brought here against their will. Others came for the same promise of opportunity as the white colonists came. And some were already living here as full-fledged citizens of the various American Indian nations. Secondly, Africans participated in colonial society at different levels. So some were skilled wage earning laborers, others were temporarily enslaved as indentured servants, others could vote and owned property, and still others were permanently enslaved and considered to be property. Thirdly, they spoke different languages. So, of course, the ones that were already here spoke the language of their American Indian family. Those who had been kidnapped from Africa and brought here spoke their native language, at least for a while. And those who were enslaved tended to take on the language of their enslaver. So, for instance, Sojourner Truth was enslaved by a Dutch family, so she spoke Dutch. Unfortunately for the Africans, they remained diverse, which complicated any efforts for them to form political alliances and work against the social injustices that they all faced. Then there was the native population of American Indians, an Afro-Asiatic Caucasoid ethnic mix. They coexisted in parallel societies. So they weren't technically in the colonies, but as trade partners, they were certainly affected by colonial politics. They spoke different languages, but the indigenous cultures had a stabilizing commonality to them at first. But as the various nations embraced the imperialist culture of their colonial neighbors, the native cultures, unfortunately for them, diverged and which created a ripple effect that ultimately sealed their doom. Then there was slavery, which, of course, was not a demographic in itself, but it was a presence that created the demographic of the perpetually enslaved class, who replaced the landless labor class at the bottom of the social order. So the landless labor class used to be on the bottom rung of society, but with the creation of the permanently enslaved, they moved up a notch. Similarly, there was a culture clash that was playing out in the background of colonial society between the indigenous culture of the natives versus the imperialist culture of the colonists. So what's the difference? Well, an indigenous culture promotes living in harmony with nature, mutual respect for other peoples and cultures, the inherent equality of humans despite social inequality. And the economy is driven by shared wealth. By contrast, an imperialist culture promotes not harmony, but power and domination. Social inequality confers superior or inferior status and demands not mutual respect, but respect of only the inferior for the superior, allowing the highest social class with social status, with a superior social status, to control and exploit everyone else. Instead of a shared wealth, the economy is driven by endless competition, rugged individualism, and relentless accumulation of private wealth. So, with all this going on, who was running things in the colonies? The power brokers or ruling elite, so to speak. Well, the American Indians held some power to the extent that they controlled the land. But prior to the revolution, they still largely existed outside colonial society. It was the whites who had organized the colonies that had all the power. But not all white people had power. Power was the domain of men. So white men had all the power. But again, not all white men had power. Colonial power was restricted to white men who had title to a substantial amount of land or access to a substantial amount of money. That is, the white male haves. And by substantial amount of land, I mean thousands, often tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And the haves maintained their grip on power by establishing asset requirements for elected officials. That was a power structure that they inherited with the imperialist culture from Britain, where money and land made the difference between wealth, power, and prestige, or poverty, subjugation, and exploitation. And these asset requirements were really quite stringent in some colonies. Sometimes there weren't even enough rich white men to go around. And they had to rotate through political offices to ride out term limits before returning to an office they previously had held, or even hold multiple offices simultaneously. One more thing about the colonies: for all of them, charter, proprietary, and royal, ultimate power lay with the British government. That meant the superior authority of the king and parliament carried with it the power to reduce the white male haves who ruled in the colonies to the status of inferior subjects, equal not only to have nots, but also to women, children, and even enslaved Africans. Matter of fact, in their protests, the rebellious colonists literally accused the British government of aiming to reduce them to slavery. This was tyranny of the highest order, and some of the once comfortable colonial rulers began feeling exploited, abused, and insecure. In other words, they became radical. So the Revolutionary War was waged between patriots and loyalists from all segments of colonial society. The patriots were generally the radicals who fought for independence in order to elevate their social status. The loyalists were generally conservatives who fought to preserve their connection to, dependence on, and the protection of Britain. There were haves and have nots on both sides, but they were motivated by their different experiences of pain, which gave them very different ideas about freedom and equality. So, for the ruling elite patriots, the haves, their pain was the king and parliament who could undermine their authority, dismiss their power, and reduce their social status at will. Freedom to them meant supreme power. They already saw themselves as rulers, but they wanted to elevate their social status to that of the king with ultimate authority. All men are created equal meant hereditary kingship was unfair. The right to rule should not be automatically bestowed as with royal inheritance. It should be earned as with elected representatives, like they were. The ruling elite had no intention or desire to upset the colonial social order in which they were firmly perched at the top. And they expected the have nots to remain content in their place at the bottom. For the have not patriots, upsetting the social order was precisely what they were in it for. Pain to them, their pain was their place at the bottom. Freedom to them meant democracy and power to the people, the individual people, that being themselves. All men are created equal meant eliminating the privileges of wealth. And for unenslaved Africans, whose personal freedom was nonetheless subject to social and political inequality, it had the additional meaning of no more double standards for white freemen versus African freemen, and ultimately liberation for their enslaved brethren. These were those universal liberal tenets that we talked about: the promise of personal freedom, protection for private property, and political equality for all that forged the Patriot Alliance and sustained it through the revolution. And during the revolution, the difference between the freedom of the haves versus the freedom of the have nots was largely overshadowed by the urgency of relieving their pain. The haves never imagined that equality even could mean the rich and powerful, the poor and landless, and the current and formerly enslaved should all have the same privileges. The have nots never imagined they were fighting for anything less. So, what about the American Indians and the enslaved Africans? What side did they fight on? How did the Constitutional Convention set the stage for the Civil War? And what does all this have to do with politics today? Civil War politics in the 21st century, legacy of the revolution, continues in part 2.